To St James's Park. Keith Downey is there for us. Keith, here we go again. You, me, Alexander Isak. What's the latest?
Look, Mike, not really too much has changed since we last spoke about 5 minutes ago. No, since we last spoke, I think at the tail end of last week, as we saw, Alexander Isak was left out of the Newcastle, both the Newcastle squads that played here in St James's Park on Friday night and then Saturday in their last two friendly matches before the start of the season. And of course, Eddie Howe fielded questions on it after both of those games. His words were that he can't select Alexander Isak right now, and he would love to do that, and if he could change things or change Alexander Isak's mind, he said he would have done it yesterday. So he didn't go as far as saying Alexander Isak is refusing to train or refusing to play, but he made it clear, reading between the lines, that Isak's head is probably not in the right place for him to be performing for Newcastle United at the moment, and that is why he is essentially training on his own. I don't think he's seen any of his teammates really since he returned from his self-imposed training visit over to Real Sociedad, when of course he went out there for a week on his own. The rest of the players have all been training as normal in the mornings, and Alexander Isak's been turning up round about 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon to put himself through his own paces. So look, it's becoming a bit of a toxic situation, isn't it? Not what Newcastle want ahead of the new season. And Eddie Howe says he doesn't see that changing ahead of their trip to Villa Park in the season opener on Saturday lunchtime. I don't think we're going to see anything definitive to this situation until the transfer window is closed. We know Liverpool have made one bid, £110 million plus add-ons. That was flatly rejected by Newcastle, and I've been saying for a number of weeks now, Newcastle will only allow Alexander Isak to go if, one, they receive a huge offer that they can't refuse, I think anything round about £150 million, and two, they're able to get a ready-made replacement. They tried and failed for Benjamin Sesko last week. Of course, he went to Manchester United, and it feels like the options for Newcastle are now very thin on the ground. So I think as the days go on, it's becoming increasingly likely that Alexander Isak will remain a Newcastle United player this window. And of course, bridges are going to have to be mended, because the Newcastle fans are not happy with what they've seen from his conduct over the last couple of weeks. So it feels like a lot of work is going to have to be done behind the scenes to ensure that they can get together. Newcastle need him, he needs Newcastle, and move on into the start of the season.
Keith, those bridges will be bigger than the Tyne Bridge, I reckon. Let's talk Johan Wissa. Any movement on that one?
Yeah, well, look, Mike, this is becoming a bit of a saga as well. Newcastle desperate to bring him in. He's desperate to come here to Newcastle. Of course, as we know, he's not been involved with Brentford in their last couple of pre-season friendlies or really in training either. We're told that Brentford want to bring in a replacement first before allowing him to leave. Not dissimilar, really, from the Alexander Isak situation here. But again, this one has dragged on for a couple of weeks too. I think if Newcastle had their way, they would like to have him in before the match against Aston Villa on Saturday. Look, there still is a chance of that, but it's a domino effect, isn't it? Because they are waiting on Brentford bringing someone else in themselves, and of course they then need to agree a fee with Brentford. But it's been a protracted one, that one. But I still do expect him to sign for Newcastle. It's just not been quite as simple as many would have hoped.
OK, and what about at the other end of the pitch, in defence? One in, one out, is that the situation?
Well, definitely one in the shape of Malik Chow. He arrived late last night into the northeast to undergo his medical today. That's after Newcastle struck a deal with AC Milan at the weekend. They've been scouting this player for a number of years. They've been to watch him live 8 times, and Andy Howe, who's led negotiations in this, has actually been over to Italy to meet AC Milan twice throughout the summer. So it looks like they've managed to land their man in a deal round about £35 million. So that's the central defender they've been looking for a long time. You asked me about one out. I think you're alluding there to Kieran Trippier. I'm not saying that he's going to leave, but my information is that AS Monaco are interested in the Newcastle right back and are hoping to explore a deal. Now, I don't think Newcastle will want to lose Kieran Trippier. He's a vital cog within the club. You know, he's one of the go-to players for Eddie Howe in terms of his leadership behind the scenes. And of course, remember, he was the first signing after the takeover, the PIF takeover back in October 2021, and he's helped attract a number of players to the squad. So Newcastle will not want to lose him because they're a little bit light at the back at the moment, but some definite interest there from AS Monaco in his services. Remember, he's only got 1 year left on his Newcastle United contract.
Right, let's talk Alexander Isak. We have to do that. Less than 3 weeks now until the close of the window. So what's your reading of the situation?
Look, I think the longer this goes on, the longer there is stalemate, so to speak, the more likelihood there is of Alexander Isak playing for Newcastle this season. Look, Liverpool came in for him 10 days ago, didn't they, with that bid of £110 million plus add-ons. It feels like it's been a long 10 days since then. Now, of course, as we know, Newcastle tried to line up a replacement for him. They thought Benjamin Sesko was that man. Instead, of course, he opted for Manchester United at the last moment, and it left Newcastle high and dry. I feel their options now, between now and the end of the transfer window, are getting less and less. And I think there's a huge question mark hanging over the Isak deal, because Newcastle will not allow the Swedish striker to leave and join Liverpool if they don't have a ready-made replacement lined up. As I say, the options are fairly thin on the ground, and as the days tick on, I would say it's increasingly likely that he will be a Newcastle player this season. Certainly for the first part of the season anyway. We'll wait and see what happens in January. But of course, with that, there's going to have to be a lot of work behind the scenes. Clearly not happy, Alexander Isak, but neither are the Newcastle United supporters. It feels like there's been a lot of bridges burned these last couple of weeks. They're not happy with his conduct, so a lot is going to have to be smoothed over behind the scenes for him to continue here and continue in a positive way, because he was a real fan's favourite. Think of all those Newcastle fans, Mike, who of course he reduced to tears at the cup final back in March with that winner against Liverpool. People have got Isak 14 tattooed all over their body. You see kids in the street everywhere in Newcastle with Isak 14 on their shirt. And I think for them, they just feel really let down by his conduct these last couple of weeks. So Eddie Howe's going to have to do his best man management skills with not just the player, but with the supporters as well, to ensure that they can move on from this. But look, there is still 3 weeks left. I wouldn't be surprised if Liverpool came in with another bid. But until Newcastle have a ready-made replacement, and as I say, they don't have many options left, until they get someone in, Alexander Isak will be going nowhere.
OK, what about Johan Wissa? Will he be joining Newcastle?
Yeah, I'm just off a call literally in the last 5 minutes about that. Look, Newcastle remain at the table, very hopeful of getting a deal done. But again, this one's become a bit of a saga now as well. It's dragged on for a number of weeks. Brentford, probably in a similar situation to Newcastle with Isak. They don't want to allow Wissa to go until they get a replacement in themselves. Now, we know that they're in talks with Dango Outara, the Bournemouth winger. I think there's a potential, if they get him in, that they might soften their stance a little bit with Wissa. I think Newcastle would love to have him in by the weekend to try and involve him against Aston Villa, but it's a waiting game for them. I still think there's a high chance of this deal getting done, but again, it's a very protracted transfer, a bit like the Isak situation, really. They're playing out very, very similarly. And look, Newcastle have been patient. It looks like they're going to have to still be a little bit more patient if they're to bring in Wissa. But remember, even if Wissa does arrive, that has no effect on the Alexander Isak situation. Wissa is the replacement for Callum Wilson, and if Isak was to leave, they would still need to bring in another replacement to allow Isak to go. So I've seen a few people saying, oh, you get Wissa and that means that Isak will be allowed to leave. That's not the case. The two are completely unrelated.
Indeed. What about Kieran Trippier? Is he leaving?
Yeah, finally, just some news we brought to you just a couple of hours ago, Mike. There's some interest in Kieran Trippier from AS Monaco over in France. He's got just 1 year left in his Newcastle deal. Look, Newcastle will not want to lose Kieran Trippier. He's such a big character in the dressing room. He's one of the leadership group. He was the first signing who came in after the takeover back in 2021. So Newcastle know how much he brings to the party behind the scenes. They know how important he is to the club. But I think the interest is genuine from AS Monaco, and they are exploring a deal. There's not been any contact with Newcastle officially yet, but they are considering making an approach for the England international fullback.
Keith, for the moment, thank you. We'll be back to you in a little while.